Very much for attending. This is the Planning Commission meeting of February 1st, 2012. And could you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Commissioner Everson.
Here.
Commissioner Cummings.
Here.
Commissioner Goldberg.
Here.
Commissioner Galbraith. Here. And Chair Maslavic.
Here. Approval of the agenda. By motion of the Planning Commission, this is the time to notify the public of any changes to the agenda, rearrange the order of the agenda, and provide an opportunity for any member of the Planning Commission or staff to request an item be removed from the consent calendar for separate action. I believe there are items to be removed from this consent calendar. Is this the place where we're going to do that?
Yes.
Okay. Would you, Mr. Director?
Yes. We are suggesting, staff is suggesting that actually all three items be removed from the consent calendar. Item number 2 is an item which is being continued and renoticed, so we should do that as a separate item. Item 3, there's some questions I know on the part of the Planning Commission, and then we received a letter of opposition that we'd like to talk about, and the minutes we may as well just remove because it would be voted on separately anyway. So staff would recommend that all 3 consent calendar items be voted on separately.
Okay. Do we have any discussion by the Planning Commissioners on the agenda adjustment? Not seeing none, we need to vote, right?
That's correct.
Please vote. Okay, 5-0. This is the time that members of the public may address the Planning Commission regarding any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the Commission cannot discuss or take action on any item not on the agenda unless authorized by law. Those members of the public wishing to speak are asked to come forward to the microphone and state their name for the record. All speakers will be limited to a period of 5 minutes. Is there anyone that would like to speak to the Planning Commission? Okay, seeing none. I like the rewording of this part of the agenda. It's much clearer than it used to be. Okay, then we will take the approval of the Planning Commission meeting minutes of January 18th, 2012. Are there any discussion from the Planning Commission?
I move that they be accepted as presented.
Second.
I second.
Okay, please vote. Okay, 5-0. Planning Commission meeting minutes are approved. Minor use permit 11-5, A95 Surfside Avenue. Can we have a staff report, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. This item is for minor use permit 11-5 at A95 Surfside Avenue to construct a glass and stucco architectural element on the rooftop deck that is approximately 35 square feet in area and exceeds the 35-foot height limit by approximately 3 feet for an approximate overall height of 38 feet. This particular application has been amended. It was continued from our last Planning Commission meeting of January 18th to this meeting. The applicant has subsequently amended the application, so we will need to renotice the amended application, and we are planning to bring this item back before the Commission at the February 15th Planning Commission hearing.
So at this time, if the Commission agrees with that recommendation, simply a motion to continue to, I wouldn't continue to date certain since we're going to renotice anyways. So just a motion to continue.
Just a motion to continue.
Correct.
I'll make a motion to continue the item.
Second.
Okay, please vote. 5-0. Okay, item 11-5 is continued. Minor use permit 20-12, B86 Surfside Avenue. Can we have a staff report, please?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the commission, this item is for minor use permit 12-1 at B86 Surfside Avenue. The request is to construct a non-habitable architectural feature in excess of the 35-foot height limit. The applicant proposes to construct a covered roof access structure and a solid roof patio cover to exceed the height limit by approximately 1 foot 9 inches at the peak of the proposed roof, to an approximate height of 36 feet 9 inches. In the staff report, there was mentioned that one letter in opposition was received that was not included with the packets that went out to the commissioners last week. We received that letter on Monday. I had expected to receive it last week and forgot to change the language, but we did in fact receive that letter on Monday, and that should have been distributed to all of the commissioners. Additionally, this evening, we received a series of photographs from an adjacent neighbor, and that neighbor is here tonight. I'm assuming he would like to speak on the matter. I don't see the applicant here this evening. I've been trying to contact him for almost a week now to no avail, so I would suggest that maybe the commission open the public hearing and receive testimony, but we may not be able to make a decision tonight without the applicant in attendance.
Okay. Are there any questions of the staff from the commission? Okay. Open the public hearing. Is there anyone here that would like to speak on this application?
Hello, my name is John Cahoon, and I'm here representing two people. One is for Casey Coltrip, that he's a Surfside board member. And then also as myself, I'm an owner of C13 and I'm a tenant of C14. C13 is directly behind the B86, so we're directly in line behind there. The photos you see where I'm a tenant, and that's adjacent just to the north, one property right next door. Let me start on behalf of the Surfside Colony. Just like you said that they have the opposition letter here. One point that they wanted to make was that there's really two structures here. There's one for the CSRA, which covers the roof access, but there's a secondary structure, which is really just a covered patio. And of all the guidelines here, the the CSRA is really where the height exceptions allowed, but it's really, there's no code that says it's okay to do a patio cover above 35 feet. Okay, so that's just a position that I'm passing on. As a tenant, sorry, as an owner, one of the issues is that the report says that it doesn't block the view of anyone. I purchased that home in 2006 with the primary objective of building up and building a new home. I've been a resident next door at C14 for approximately 15 plus years, and we bought that home to build it up. As you can see in the pictures, this is what it looks like. I've got that handout, the front one, and it really spans the entire view of the front, so it would block my view. And my point on the next page is the typical architecture in the neighborhood is for the doghouse or the stairwell cover to be there, but if I was sitting on my deck and the neighbor was sitting on theirs, that you could see through. As you can see in that second picture, I can't see the ocean on the stairwell cover, but adjacent to that I can. So it's my position that if they were to do that, it's essentially going to block my view from the deck when I build in the future. So technically it's not blocking my view today, but I certainly expect to build a house there in the future. On the third picture, I was just proving the point that even to my left, you can see my roof on the bottom picture, that little, how low it is. It's a 2-story, 915 square feet beach shack. But even to the left, you'll see that it's just the doghouses up there, that nobody is really expanding the entire width. So the idea is to kind of have it this way so you can see past. I'm kind of torn because I like the idea of what he did, but the fact is if you allow him to do it, then I think I deserve a similar exception if I were to build, which if I were him, I would oppose it because I would block from his patio. My house has a terrific bay view, so I'm by the parking lot if you've ever been there, and it's an unobstructed bay view. But if I were to build that on the back of my property and completely go across, my property is even a little wider than his deck that he'd be blocked in, and he couldn't see the ocean, and he also can't see the bay. And I can't imagine either a future property owner or him not being upset with me completely blocking his view. So if you set a precedent like this, which I don't see it anywhere else in the neighborhood, again, it may even be good for me, and it'd be something that I would expect that precedence to be carried on forward. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Can I have a question?
Yes, of course.
When were these photographs taken?
About 2 hours ago.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask you one question? Are you a representative of the architectural committee?
I am not.
Okay. So you don't speak on their behalf. You mentioned you were here to represent Casey Coltrip.
Yeah, Casey couldn't make it, and he knew I was coming, so he sent me a few bullet items that he wanted me to address. But
Okay.
And is Casey speaking for the board when he gave you those bullets?
he did, yes.
My question was in regards to the process of how we've gone from the initial phases of a permit application to what's built out there today.
Right.
And my question was, what's the current status of the approval process with the Surfside Colony Architectural Committee?
So his opinion that he wrote was that that the plans as approved by the colony were not followed, and the owner went ahead and built the structure you see now without any prior approval. He did so at his own risk, and the non-conforming height should be removed down to 35 feet. I think they have two issues. One is they want the doghouse a little smaller, but also that they want the covered patio removed. Surfside would prefer the look of the original drawings as approved by the colony and believe it is possible to still build as approved. So as far as I'm aware, the owner changed his plans midstream from what the architectural committee at Surfside approved, and they haven't approved the new plans.
And so this is a question for staff, at what point did the city find out that the proposed structure was deviating from what was approved? I assume the same plans that were approved by the architectural committee were initially approved by the city.
That is correct. The city became aware of the modification during an inspection. Our building official visited the site. I'm not sure if it was for a rough framing inspection, but noticed that the structure that had been partially constructed did deviate from the original approved plans, at which time it was brought to my attention. I visited the site and noticed that there had been a change in plans, and at that time informed the applicant or the property owner that they would to continue finishing the structure with the roof deck structure as it exists would require a minor use permit from the Planning Commission. And at that point, the owner decided to apply for that to see if the commission would be willing to approve the plans as modified. I do have a little, if I can, whoops, there we go. If you notice on the roof elevation here, this blue box roughly represents the portion of the structure that exceeds 35 feet. The original plans that were submitted to the city and to the Surfside Architectural Committee had the covered roof access. This revised plan is showing a roof slope with a roof with an approximate 3 and 12 slope. The original roof structure was roughly a 6 and 12 slope that came up roughly right in here, and the peak of that roof was just a hair under 35 feet. And then there was a California framed roof structure that came out. The ridge went out this direction. It was a little less than I believe the overall height was 34 feet 10 inches at the peak on the covered stair access, and then the California framed roof member was slightly below that and came out this direction. From my conversation with the property owner, once they started building out the roof deck, they realized with the stair, they realized that the plans as originally drawn would not be adequate to provide enough headroom clearance to still keep the floors intact and have that covered roof access structure. So what the applicant did at that point, apparently, was change the plans in the field without knowledge of the city and went ahead and framed this structure as it's drawn here, which, again, wasn't discovered until an inspector went out to inspect the framing for the entire house.
Thank you.
If I may, what you're really looking at there in that center is really the covered patio. Based on that first picture, you can see to the far right on the front, really the stairwell's to the far side of the property. And as an individual, I'm not opposed to anything he wants to do there. He can go 40 feet as far as I'm concerned. It's just really the covered patio that...
The covered access structure is roughly these walls right here. The roof ridge is approximately right here. And then this is all open out to the roof deck. But essentially, this does act as a solid roof patio cover on this side of this wall.
What portion of that covered patio is above the required height?
Everything with the blue, everything where the blue box is essentially above 35 feet. So you have roughly this area in here exceeds the 35-foot height limit by approximately 1 foot 9 inch at the ridge, less as you get further out from the ridge.
But at the edges, technically, he could go higher than what he is now. At the very outer walls.
Slightly. He could, if he left the sloped structure outside of the blue box and just carried it across as a flat roof right there, he would be entirely within the 35-foot height limitation. But the problem is, at least how it's built today, is that the headroom at roughly this, the 35-foot height from when I was out there up on the roof, the 35-foot height limit is approximately right at the door header. So he could probably, with some very minor modification, get it to fit in. But once you put the roof structure back on that, he may exceed by a few inches, but it may be possible to. Staff was just looking at it from an architectural standpoint, that to just lop off that ridge and make it flat would look kind of awkward architecturally.
I agree.
So if I give a quick summary? The board, I believe, wants rid of the covered patio as well as me as a landowner there. The covered stairwell access, I'm okay with it as he's got, and then the board, I think, says the total overall square footage exceeds the code, and so I think they want some additional work, and not sure exactly what that is, but they think that the overall square footage of just the stairwell is too big.
I'm not certain, but is there no longer a code provision for the maximum square footage for a stairwell cover?
There was never anything codified that prescribed specific square footages. It was in the previous code, the Chapter 28 zoning code, it was more a guideline. In the new Title 11 zoning code, one of the findings that need to be made for the approval of a covered roof access structure is that the minimum square footage is requested to enclose the covered roof access structure. Now, this does slightly exceed that minimum square footage. These walls, this door doesn't, let's see, no, that is correct. They would need a minimum, when you come up from the stairs here, you would need a minimum 3-foot landing from that stair. Now, this wall could possibly be brought in slightly, as could this, or I don't think they would want to reconfigure the staircase, but it would be possible, I believe, to bring these walls in slightly to reduce that footprint of the covered roof access structure. But one of the things with the recommendation for the smallest footprint possible, it came out of about probably 20 years ago when a lot of these were being built in Surfside and in Old Town when they were still allowed in Old Town. We had a number of people requesting covered roof access structures that essentially were small rooms. Some of them were as large as 200, 300 square feet, where you could theoretically create living space there, put a sofa, a television, that sort of thing. Staff feels that because this dimension, you have 3'2", which you would need a minimum 3-foot landing from that door to meet building code requirements, and this 2.5 feet here, there really is no usable space. Now, again, the footprint probably could be reduced, but I think staff was looking at it from the standpoint of there really isn't any usable space here to be able to create living space. And I'm not sure how much you could bring this particular wall in because of the requirement for the landing at the door.
Well, excuse me. You've got the landing right there where it says 3'4". Isn't that the doorway out of the stairway?
This is where the stair comes up.
Okay, there's your 3 feet, and that's it. You wouldn't need the rest of that space at all.
You could go that way, and you wouldn't have to go that
So
way.
this wall, you're saying?
Yeah,
could come,
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that dimension, I guess it would
So
have to be 36 inches.
Therefore, the CRS would be smaller, wouldn't bulk up that roof as much, and somebody may have a view corridor through there.
I think part of the reason that was done is because the way the roof is designed now, the slope down here still wouldn't give you enough door clearance for you have to still, I guess, to put a door right there, you wouldn't have adequate clearance. You wouldn't to
Well, these are design issues that need to be dealt with, and maybe we can do that when the architect and the owner are here, and we can discuss that.
Yeah, I was about to suggest the other thing we might be able to do is have the building official, if the commission were to take any action on this tonight, I think the building official could look at what is the smallest footprint that would be allowed and still meet the exiting requirements, and I think that's probably enough direction for him to look at that and shrink that appropriately.
All the other dog houses have flat roofs, and that way they can accommodate the height there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's unfortunate that he did this without checking first, but we'll all discuss it at the next meeting. Thank you very much. Are there any other
I
questions?
just had one more question. I don't know if you can answer this or not. Has the applicant reapplied to the Surfside Colony?
Not aware.
Thank you.
was that answered? Did you?
He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure.
He did apply to the Surfside Colony. The Surfside Colony did not approve the revised plan.
Okay. They denied his revision?
Correct. They prefer that it be built as it was originally approved.
And has there been any modification plans resubmitted to the city?
This is the revised plan that
Okay.
was.
And just to clarify one point, approval of the Surfside Colony's Architectural Review Committee is not a prerequisite to approval from the city for this minor use permit. That's a civil matter between the members of that HOA.
Yeah, I wasn't looking at it to consider trying to enforce any association rules. My point was more to our own code, in which under this particular minor use permit, we're supposed to consider whether such variation is appropriate for the integrity of the neighborhood. And so for that reason, that's why I brought that question up.
Any other questions from the commission? Yes,
I
Mr.
have a question for Mr. Calhoun, and it's kind of related to your board. And that is,
He's not on the board, but he's representing one person.
right, perhaps you know this, the answer to this question as a resident owner. I mean, what power does your board have to stop a project like this if the board has objections?
I'm not aware, although I am a broker, licensed real estate broker, and there are no CCNRs in that particular communities. So if you ask, my personal opinion is they don't have much power there, but it's a civil matter, and I'm not sure what power they do have. But I know as an owner, I do not have CCNRs on my property there. Tricky. Yeah.
Okay. All right, since there isn't representation by the property owner or from the property owner, can we make a motion to continue this item? We'll leave the public hearing open, is that correct?
Yes, and could we have the maker of the motion continue it to the next meeting, February 15th?
Okay, would someone like to do that?
I'll move to have the item continued to our next meeting of February 15th.
Second.
Okay, please vote. Okay, 5-0, the item is continued to the next meeting.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the pictures. Okay, the other item on the agenda is, under scheduled matters, is the Planning Commission reorganization. Selection of chair, vice chair. That's the first item, number 4. So let's get on with that. We need a motion for a chair, right? Do I need to pass the gavel?
I think it's probably appropriate for you as the chair to open the nomination and have one of your fellow commissioners or one or more of them make nominations and then vote, and then move to the vice chair.
Okay, we'll open nominations for reorganization of the Planning Commission. Anybody like to make a nomination? I guess for chairs first, okay.
I'd like to nominate Sandra to be chair again for this coming year.
Second.
Okay, any other nominations? None. Please vote. 5-0. You know I voted for myself now. Okay, and we'll open nominations for vice chair. Would someone like to make a nomination for vice chair?
I'd like to nominate Esther Cummings.
Second.
Okay, any other nominations? None? Okay, please vote. Okay, good, it's 5-0. All right, we're set for another year, kids.
Did we get a raise?
Yeah, sure.
Get twice as much money.
Yeah, there we go.
Close your eyes and what do you see? The next item on the agenda is a presentation regarding the California Environmental Quality Act, which we commonly refer to as CEQA, and the CEQA guidelines. I understand our Assistant City Attorney will be doing the presentation.
Yes, it'll actually be, Steve and I will go down and do the presentation. We do have handouts here of the PowerPoint for each of the commissioners. And maybe what I'll do is give a little introduction and then let Steve start. Steve and I have been talking about this for the last several weeks, recognizing that we do have, the Planning Commission, I should say, does have the final environmental impact report for the DWP project that you will be reviewing in the coming months. And it's been a while since the Commission has reviewed an environmental impact report, so we thought this was a good time. Our intent is to try to do this in one meeting, but we can certainly continue this to a subsequent meeting if that's necessary.
Okay.
So with that,
I moved down here just so it's more conversational.
Right.
So that I can readily see you and you all readily see me, because our goal is not to have me just talking to you the whole time of lecture, but that really have it more of a workshop, so that if you all have questions along the way, feel free to stop me and drill down on a few points. The overall presentation, you can see I've decided how to read the EIR. We're going to focus on the basic methodology of EIRs, talk about how thank you, Mark, how they're prepared and what's in there and how you should, so it's just some tips for effectively reading them. So without further ado, like I said, we're going to talk about how to read an EIR. And the reason why I think this is necessary is that EIRs tend to be very big, very large, very dense, and they usually come up with, they're used for very important and sometimes controversial projects. I think just having like some tips in mind about how to effectively read an EIR would be beneficial to the commission. I know I found it kind of beneficial to myself to kind of stop and think about what I need to look at when I'm reading the EIR, because I read it too, Mark reads it too. You're not the only one stuck with this. It is a chore, but it's part of our job, and it serves an important public purpose. So the three basic topics I want to cover are what is an EIR, what is in an EIR, and then, like I said, talk about a little bit more at length about how to effectively read an EIR. So, what is an EIR? You still following the sounds? Go ahead. Okay. Now, there's a lot of jargon and acronyms and initialisms used in land use and in CEQA in particular. I'm going to try to avoid all of them except for two. The first one is EIR. What is it? It is an environmental impact report. It is a report document. It's not a decisional document. It's an informational document. And it's required by law, and the law in particular is CEQA, which we throw around a lot, and that stands for California Environmental Quality Act. And that's just the law that requires the city and other agencies to consider the environmental impacts of certain types of discretionary approvals. So what do you find in the EIR when you open it up? Well, like I said, we're not there yet. Like I said, an EIR is an informational document, and what it does is, its purpose is to analyze and disclose to the public and decision makers the environmental consequences of their project approvals. Now, it's not just simply a series of summary statements. It is a technical, professionally prepared document, and therefore it is supported by substantial evidence. And that evidence are the technical studies and data that people have gone out into the field and they've studied these issues, and they're contained in technical reports upon which the environmental report is then based. So that is what an EIR is supposed to be. It's an informational document. It's a disclosure tool. There are certain things that an EIR certainly should not be. And it's not simply a means of generating paper. And it sometimes seems that way. You're going to see very voluminous reports, but that's not the entire purpose. CEQA actually says that EIR should run between 150 to 300 for the more complicated projects. I'll be the first to admit that in most cases, we well exceed 300 pages. And that is just to make the document legally defensible, to disclose as much as possible. So it does run over, and this is a fact of life with EIRs. An EIR should not be just an opportunity to obfuscate behind jargon. Like I said, there's a lot of acronyms used. There's a lot of highly technical information in there. Again, that's kind of an unfortunate byproduct of the process. But the goal of CEQA is to render that information into plain language as well as can be done, given the highly technical nature of the subject. And lastly, an EIR is not a tool to simply obstruct projects that one does not like. It's sometimes perceived that is what CEQA has become, but what I would like this commission to do is to really realize that the document is a tool for your use, for the public's use, to try and understand the consequences of a given project. Now, the process of preparing an EIR begins with planning professionals, either in-house, like Mark and Jerry, or sometimes there are professional planners who work outside of local agencies who do this professionally. They take technical and engineering and planning studies, like traffic studies or air quality studies. They use that information to prepare a draft EIR that analyzes the impacts. They also accept public input, and that's a big part of the process that CEQA requires. We've been accepting comments on the draft EIR for this latest project for some time now. That's a very important part of the process. So the public input and the professional input become part of that EIR. Then it comes to you all. It's reviewed by the Planning Commission to determine its legal adequacy. It also gives you an opportunity to ask questions about the impacts that are discussed in the report. And ultimately, it has to go to the City Council. And the City Council's job with respect to an EIR is to certify the document. Now, certification is not the same thing as approving the project. What certification is making a judgment and a decision that says that the EIR is legally adequate and properly discloses all the environmental impacts of the project. So that's what the EIR is. That's what how it gets prepared, what is inside of it. Well, it's a pretty standard pattern at this point. Almost all EIRs will follow this basic pattern. You'll have an executive summary. That's the first thing you're going to see in the document. It provides the briefest overview of where the significant impacts of the project are, what the project is, and what mitigation might be proposed for some of those projects. You'll typically find a global discussion at some point maybe of the environmental setting. That is the baseline conditions out there on the ground today before a project occurs. So not looking necessarily backwards, but right now, what is on the ground now? There'll be for each impact area, such as air quality or traffic, you'll get a threshold of significance, and I'll talk about that topic a little bit later and more in depth. Then you'll get your impact analysis, a discussion of how the project is predicted to change the environmental setting, and discussion of whether or not that change is deemed significant. If there are significant impacts or potentially significant impacts, the ER will contain a discussion of mitigation measures, which are designed to lessen or avoid the impacts of the project. Ultimately, we need conclusions about what the impacts will be after the mitigation. And then after we've looked at the impacts of a particular project, we look at the impacts of the project when looked at with other projects that may be coming aboard. This is a discussion of cumulative impacts. And again, we'll talk about that more in detail later. Finally, you'll see a discussion of alternatives, other projects that might be approved that might avoid or lessen some of the impacts of a project. So how is the EIR used once it's been read and looked at? Well, it's reviewed by the public and decision makers. It's not just done for your benefit, it's for everybody's benefit. And the decision makers, you're going to use the information in the EIR to decide whether the project should be approved. It'll be one facet of the information that you're going to be getting. It only talks about environmental impacts, and this is an important point that Mark and I have talked about, and he really wants to make sure that everybody understands that the EIR is focused on environmental impacts, not necessarily economic impacts or larger policy issues outside of what the Planning Commission normally deals with. All of those other issues can be brought to bear on the ultimate question of whether or not a project be approved. And so you look at those issues and the information. You're going to use that information in the EIR amongst all this other information you get.
I do want to just kind of jump in here for a moment. I think the point that Steve brought up is an important point, that a city can certify an EIR and still deny a project. In other words, there may not be any environmental consequences created by the project, but it can still be a bad planning project from a community development standpoint. So there are two issues that will be coming before the Planning Commission and ultimately the Council over the next couple of months. One is, have the environmental effects of the project been adequately analyzed and addressed? That's question number one from the EIR standpoint.
That's the sequel question.
That's the sequel question. And then question number two is, does the project make sense for the community? And that's, just from a land use and, again, community development standpoint. So you have to go through both exercises first. The first one is the environmental review. Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, we have the DWP project coming, so
correct.
It's the big elephant in the room. So
right.
But getting to your point, it's a very important point. But are you going to ask us to wear those two different hats at the same meeting? In other words,
we haven't prepared the agenda yet for that meeting. Some cities do them as parallel processes where the Planning Commission will both be reviewing the environmental impact report and doing project review at the same meeting. sometimes they trail one another. So at this point, we haven't put together the final agenda, so that's a good question, but one that I really can't answer tonight.
If you really want clarity, and a distinction that you made, which is, look at the EIR from a sequel adequacy point of view versus, do we like the project, not like the project for other reasons. To me, it would just be cleaner if it was a different meeting, personally.
Yeah.
Because that's a hard distinction, and it'll be hard for the public to understand, hard for us to, we can do it with your guidance in this direction, but when you start doing it at the same meeting, it's going to get, to me, it's going to get blurred.
Okay, we'll certainly take that into account.
That's opinion of one person's opinion.
Yeah, but at this point, we haven't put together the agenda.
Just another point that you raised about, we're kind of skirting around the issue of the DWP project. That is not on the agenda tonight. We're not going to be talking about the DWP project in any sort of detail. It may get referenced because it is just a fact that's out there, but that's not the purpose of the night. Purpose is to give you tools in order to analyze that EIR and the EIR after that and the one after that. So just to kind of caution you, and if we decide not to answer any questions you might raise about the DWP project, that's why. Okay.
But I agree with Dr. Goldberg that it should be two separate meetings, because it's going to be a long evening, and we'll be here till midnight on that. We'll probably have to continue it anyway. So my recommendation is 2 meetings or more.
Well, my recommendation is we leave that discussion aside for now, since
Agreed.
we're not going to talk about that project.
Agreed.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move ahead just a little bit more here. And like I said, we've been talking about how you're going to use the document. Well, the document is also going to be used by the public, and the document uses it, or the public uses it as a means of holding decision makers accountable, so that everybody knows what the impacts of the project are, so that decision makers know, that the people know what the impacts of the project are, so that if the project gets approved, we all have the same information about why a decision was made. And Mark already brought this issue up. EIR certification is not the same thing as project approval. And like we said, certification is the question of whether or not the EIR is legally adequate. And project approval is simply, should the project be approved based on all considerations? And again, not just the EIR. Now, my first tip as you begin reading the EIR is have at the forefront of your mind as you start the process, what are the purposes of CEQA? We kind of touched upon those already, but here's a list of some of the more important ones. One of the purposes of CEQA is to inform the decision makers, that's you, and the public, about the potential significant environmental effects prior to approval, so that you know before you approve something what are going to be the environmental consequences of that approval. The idea is also to identify environmental damage before it happens so it can be avoided or reduced. To the extent feasible, we want to prevent significant avoidable environmental damage by requiring changes, such mitigation measures in the project. We want to disclose to the public why the city is approving a project in a manner it shows, even if there are significant environmental effects involved. And this is a significant point. It is possible under CEQA to approve a project that has a significant unavoidable impact, but there's a way in which that has to be done, certain findings that have to be made. So CEQA recognizes that there are some projects that are important enough to a community that they can be approved even though they're going to have some sort of significant impact, but that's up for the city to make that balancing call.
Can other agencies, does the city get the final word, or are there other agencies that can say we disagree that environmental impact is worth it, and we're going to override the city?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to get too much into this, but EIRs are not just used by the city. If the city in this case, or when it's making an EIR, it's the lead agency. That's a term under CEQA for the agency that has the broadest jurisdictional control over the project. But as you know, projects can require multiple approvals from different agencies, Coastal Commission, for example. Those other agencies are called responsible agencies. They are responsible for approving some aspect of the project. and they will utilize the EIR as well. They have limited discretion under CEQA to reject or prepare their own environmental analysis. It usually doesn't become much of an issue because the CEQA places the onus on the lead agency, and usually I can't really think of circumstances where I've seen a responsible agency really take over the process. It's very difficult. But yes, other agencies will be using the document, and they'll make their own decisions on the project.
I think it's also important to point out, as part of the preparation process and public comment on the process, those other responsible agencies, such as the Coastal Commission or Caltrans, see the draft EIR and provide comments on the draft EIR that become part of the overall record, so that when they do, if a project is approved and they are now the permitting agency for a particular portion of the project, they've already seen the draft EIR, they've already commented on the draft EIR, so they know what's in it.
So their comments will be in the EIR when it's presented to us?
That is correct. There's a couple of opportunities for the public to weigh in, the public including other agencies, to weigh in on the preparation of an EIR. One is when a notice of preparation is sent out at the very beginning of the process. So the city, in the DWP case and in all cases, we send out a notice of preparation to the public, including all of the potentially responsible agencies, Caltrans, DWP, multiple departments within Orange County, LA County Flood Control District. So they all know that the city is preparing a document. At that point, they said, they'll submit a list of what their issues are that they would like to see addressed in the EIR. We then prepare the document based upon their comments. At the end of the process, when the draft is done, they will again see it, and they'll have an opportunity to say, yes, the city addressed the comments that we asked you to address 6 months ago, or no, you still have, we raised 12 points and you've only addressed 6 of them. So there's a couple of opportunities for them to weigh in.
And just to kind of finish off the point about public comments and other agency comments, when the city receives written comments on the draft EIR, which the city did in the case of DWP, there's a window there where the written comments are submitted. CEQA requires a written response to those comments, and so the comments themselves and the written responses to those comments become part of the final EIR. So that's where we're at right now with DWP. But so the whole document includes that draft, the written comments, and then the written responses. That becomes the final EIR.
Do you have to respond to every comment, or can you aggregate, summarize?
I've seen it done both ways. It depends on what the comments are and how many there are. Sometimes even if they're repetitive, it's just easier to respond to them saying, see a prior answer to comment XYZ. I've also seen them aggregated in so many, this agency, and this person raised this issue, and there's no one way that's required to do it. It's what works best for the drafters and the agency.
What minimizes pages.
Sorry?
What minimizes pages?
Well, that would be helpful, but sometimes that's not always the most expedient, which is why we end up with so much paper. If I can move on then to the next issue, I was just talking about the purposes of the EIR. The next tip I have for you is that you really need to focus on how CEQA requires impacts to be analyzed, because there's a very particular way that the law requires this to be done. And very simply put, the impacts are analyzed by determining the significance of the impact as measured by comparing the existing setting and the changes the project will wrought against an established threshold. So there's 3 parts to this. There's a baseline. That's the existing conditions I was talking about. That's where we start. That's our baseline. Then we also have to take into account what a threshold is. That's the point at which any change in the environment in that respect is going to be deemed significant. We determine in advance what we consider an acceptable threshold. And then we simply analyze. We project. What's the project going to do to the environment? What's the change? I often say, what's the delta? That's kind of a little bit of jargon, but what's the change? And then you compare that back to the threshold. Have we passed the threshold? If we have, the change is significant. Sounds pretty easy. Well, the problem is we have to use different thresholds and different baselines and different analysis depending on which type of impact we're going to look at. These are the typical impacts that are looked at in the EIRs that are set forth in one of the appendixes to CEQA, the CEQA guidelines. And you'll see this in almost every environmental document. You're going to look at land use. You're going to look at aesthetics, traffic, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions. That's a newer topic that under law we're required to look at. Noise, impacts of biological resources and cultural resources. The last category will include historical resources as well as archaeological resources. And it's usually where they put the paleontological resources, like fossils and such. We're also going to look at public safety impacts. Is it going to impact response time for fire or police? Those types of issues that are directly public safety. Also going to consider geology and soils, seismic issues. Water quality, that also includes hydrology, underground water impacts, as well as water service, impacts to aquatic environments. Also going to look at public services, which includes things from like libraries to schools. Are we going to be adding so much traffic or so much population that we're going to negatively impact our ability to do those? Oh, yeah. Mark pointed out something that wasn't on the list. Hazards. That's a very important issue. Hazards would be any sort of hazardous materials, whether it's part of the project or in the existing environment. That is commonly examined in EIRs. So for each one of these impact areas, there's going to be a threshold, sometimes multiple thresholds established, and multiple ways of looking at that impact and doing the analysis. So for each one of these impact areas, there are going to be different chapters. You're going to get a land use chapter. You're going to get an air quality chapter. You want to look at what's the baseline. What is out there right now in the environment? How many cars are on the road currently? What is the air quality currently? Okay, so and the baseline is almost always going to be just what the existing conditions are at the time that the city says we're going to prepare an EIR, what Mark called the notice of preparation. That's almost always what the existing conditions are. So CEQA doesn't look backwards necessarily. We don't look at what impacts were created 20 years ago, because that's not a function of this project. CEQA says, look at the current environment, look how the project is going to change that current environment.
It's not responsible for repairing mistakes made in the past.
No, and that's a constitutional limitation as much as anything, and I'm going to talk about some of the limits to mitigation later on, but just to follow up the chair's point, if there's an existing degradation to the environment that wasn't caused by the project, the Supreme Court has said we can't require a project applicant to repair that damage that they didn't cause, because it's not their fault. So once we've got the baseline established, and we found that in the chapter on air quality, well, what's the threshold? Well, the threshold is just simply a benchmark. It's one that the city has decided based on substantial evidence, which is typically the opinions of experts and based on other studies, would be the point at which the change becomes significant. And simply put, if the threshold is exceeded, the impact is deemed significant.
If I can just jump in for a moment. I think one of the things that a lot of people think of is that any change in the environment is significant and therefore an EIR is required. I think this point is really important. It's an established benchmark that needs to be exceeded before you have an impact which needs to be addressed under CEQA. In other words, if you have 4 extra cars in an intersection, that's a change to the environment. It may or may not be significant. If the benchmark is 4 additional cars is an impact, then you've exceeded that benchmark and it needs to be addressed under CEQA. So I think when people go through EIRs, when the Commission goes through the EIR in the next couple of months, it's critical to look at what are those benchmarks that are established. And that really is the analysis that Steve was talking a little bit earlier that is required for the Commission and the public to go through to determine. It's not that the environment has changed, it's just that we've exceeded this threshold.
That's an excellent point.
Can I ask a question regarding that point? How does CEQA direct the reviewers when the impact is possible, probable, uncertain? Because I think,
Well,
how do you deal with uncertainty?
when you're doing these kinds of projections, I mean, it's an exercise in thinking exercise. What's going to happen? We don't, know for certain. It's a predictive exercise. So what is usually CEQA requires is you basically make a conservative estimate. Possibly the worst case scenario in some cases, but usually it's what's reasonable. What is the reasonable projection based on the professional judgment of the people who go out and study these things? They're professional engineers and like. So there's no clear direction, but whatever projection is made has to be reasonable and has to be supported by evidence. And that's why when people go and study traffic, for instance, they project based on how many homes are going to be built, for example, how many trips will be generated. And now that's a projection. We don't really know, because we don't know somebody can move in with, a family of 8 and eventually have 5 team drivers and everybody's got a car, and so that's a lot more trips than, say, a family of 3. But we make certain assumptions based on what traffic engineers have gone out and study actually happens when you build homes. And they'll say, well, there's a ratio we use. We take, 2.4, drivers per household. We predict they'll make so many trips. So it's a series of assumptions that are made that are all backed by evidence that allow a reasonable prediction of what those conditions will be. And in certain cases, you will still say it could be worse. It could be better. So we take the most reasonable prediction we can get.
So at most reasonable, would that be equivalent to saying the most likely?
Yes. Well, reasonable in the sense that, it's the one that's considered the most likely in the terms of in the professional judgment of the people who read the document.
There are some outcomes that might be characterized as possible. That would be less probable than likely. And so what I'm wondering is, should you discount possible impacts that could cross thresholds?
Well, maybe one way to look at it is to think about earthquakes. There's a prediction about the likely earthquake that would occur on the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which runs through portions of Seal Beach. I don't remember exactly what the number is, but it's something like a likely magnitude of I think it's 6.5 or 7, somewhere along those lines. That doesn't mean that the Newport-Inglewood couldn't have a 9.0 earthquake on it, but the threshold is, or the expectation is, that it won't exceed a magnitude of 7, so that when projects design, they need to design to that likely earthquake magnitude. If we do have a 9.0 earthquake on the Newport-Inglewood Fault, that project wouldn't meet that standard. But from an environmental review standpoint, the 9 earthquake is not likely. So we don't design to that standard. Hopefully that helps provide a little clarity to the whole idea of thresholds and benchmarks, because they are very important when you go through CEQA. Obviously, if you change that benchmark, the impacts either increase or decrease.
Well, like, for example, on the chemical hazards, with the ARCO situation, we were dealing with state guidelines that indicated that a 1 out of a million chance over a lifetime of getting cancer was a significant impact, but it was extremely unlikely. So, I don't know. I don't want to belabor the point. We'll get into it.
Well, I think there seems to be a reasonableness, quantitative reasonableness in whatever gets analyzed in the EIR. You can't just come in with a 10.0 earthquake just because we need to analyze it. It has to be reasonable. And I think that's the criteria that's used most of the time.
Yes, and that is a very good point. It's the reasonableness, and it's, again, that the thresholds need to be backed up by data. In a lot of these issue areas that were on a couple of slides ago, there's very clear thresholds that have been established by either a state agency, air quality management district. So it's those standards that become the benchmarks against which projects are judged.
Okay. So, for example, here's just a sample threshold for noise. This is. I just kind of pulled this out of my head, just to kind of show you what
Talking about reasonable.
Yeah. This is not backed up by any sort of substantial evidence, but we'll pretend it is. But I just wanted to demonstrate a very simple quantitative threshold. So for noise, would the project increase an ambient noise level by 3 to 5 decibels in noise-sensitive areas? If we look at how much noise a project might make, and we look at what the ambient noise level is now, would it add, 3 to 5 decibels when you look at it from the perspective of a sensitive use? If it does, that's a significant impact. Now I'm going to complicate things, because thresholds can also be qualitative in nature. And this is a very standard land use impact threshold. Would the project conflict with any applicable land use plan, policy, or regulation adopted for the purpose of avoiding environmental impacts? There's no number there. The question is whether or not the project conflicts with plans and policies. That one's kind of harder to gauge, and because things can conflict with one policy but comport with another. So it's kind of a balancing and weighing. You look at the overall nature of the project, and how does it comport overall with those policies. You can break them down into individual policies, but maybe overall the inconsistency is not so bad. So as nice as it is to always think about thresholds in quantitative terms, and we just have to look at whether or not we've hit the magic number. Sometimes it's a judgment call. So, and we've talked about how you do the analysis. So for each impact, you've got your baseline, you've got your threshold, and now you just do the analysis. You compare the baseline to what that projection is, that reasonable projection of what the conditions will be after the project is completed. And if we hit the threshold, we have a significant impact. Now, what do you do with the impact that's significant? If it's not significant, we say, fine, we can move on. The project's acceptable in that respect. But if you have an impact in one of these impact areas, CEQA requires you to evaluate mitigation measures. So when you're reading the EIR, just to kind of backtrack where you've been, keep in mind why you're doing this. What's the purpose of the document to disclose impacts? How do you get there? You look at the baseline, you consider the threshold, you do the analysis. Now you, as readers, have to evaluate the mitigation measures that are proposed. Now, what are mitigation measures? Simply put, they're conditions that are recommended to be placed on the project to avoid or minimize or rectify, reduce, eliminate, or compensate for those significant impacts. Now, this is a pretty rough hierarchy of what CEQA wants with respect to mitigation measures. If possible, avoid the impact. So put some measure in place that would avoid the impact from ever occurring in the first place. If you can't do that, minimize it to the point where it's less than significant. If you can't do that and there's still going to be some impact, can we repair it? Can we rectify the situation? Well, reduce or eliminate, that's the avoidance part. And then if we can't rectify it, can we compensate somehow? Can we say there's a loss of open space? Can we get open space preserved somewhere else? So we're compensating for that loss elsewhere. So look at the mitigation measures that are proposed in the EIR and ask yourself, are they properly doing these things? And then for each mitigation measure, there's 5 questions you can ask to make sure that you understand how the mitigation measure is operating and why it's there. Why is the mitigation required? What's the impact? What is it trying to address? What does the mitigation measure do? Is it avoiding? Is it minimizing? Is it compensating? Who is responsible for both carrying out the mitigation? Is it the applicant? Is it the city? And then also, who's responsible for enforcing the mitigation measure? And specifically, if it's a city, what person's in the city? Is that something that's going to be caught at plan check? Is the building official going to make sure that that's enforced? Is that going to be something that's done through the planning department? Who's going to be responsible for making sure that that mitigation takes place? where does the mitigation occur? It's kind of self-evident. It's got to take place either on-site with the project or maybe along the haul route for the trucks that are coming back and forth. And when does it occur? Does it occur at grading? Does it occur before building permits are issued? Does it occur throughout the life of the project? You can have, for example, a mitigation measure that would require CC&Rs be put in place for a residential project that creates certain standards for development that's going to be carried on to the future. So that your when is just the life of the project, forever. Mitigation can't do all things, however. There are limits, legal limits to what mitigation can do. First of all, mitigation has to be feasible. You can't just require something that just won't work. I mean, it's too expensive. It can't physically be done or can't financially be done. If the mitigation measure is not feasible, it's not adequate for purposes of CEQA. So if it promises too much, it probably does. The mitigation also has to be enforceable. It can't just simply say the developer should do this. It has to be written in a mandatory language. It has to be in something that the city or some other agency can legally enforce. And it also has to be constitutional. And we raised this issue earlier with respect to repairing previously existing environmental damage. It goes a little bit beyond that. There's two basic rules when it comes to project conditions, and which mitigation is just project conditions. There are a pair of cases at the Supreme Court called Nolan and Dolan. Lawyers love it when things rhyme like that. It makes it easier for us to remember them. But the cases basically say two things. One, mitigation measures have to have a reasonable relationship with the impact they're intended to address. The courts say there has to be a nexus. So there has to be a connection between why we're requiring this mitigation and some impact created by the project. That's why we can't go back and get mitigation for something the project didn't do. So if there's something this project is going to do that's a negative for the community, we can deal with that because there's a reasonable relationship between the mitigation measure and that impact. The second thing the courts say is that it has to also be proportional. You can't require somebody to mitigate a small impact with a huge expense. Or say you're losing a little bit of open space here, you can't let a quarter of an acre of open space in one spot, you can't require them to dedicate 400 acres somewhere else. That wouldn't be proportional to the impact. So keep that in mind when you think about whether or not the mitigation you're saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if we did X, Y, or Z instead? Well, there may be reasons we can't do that. Maybe it's not workable, it's not feasible. Maybe it's just out of proportion to the nature of the impact being discussed. Or maybe there's no relationship there. So, think about those things when you're evaluating the mitigation measures. Do you have any other points on that, Mark?
I don't have any specific points, but maybe this is a good kind of place to stop and see if there are any questions from the commissioners before we go on.
Okay.
Great.
There will be a quiz later.
There will be.
Big quiz.
Okay. So now you've gone through the analysis, you've looked at the mitigation measures, and the question becomes, even after you've imposed mitigation measures, what does the EIR say about the impacts that are left? Have you actually mitigated all the impacts to less than significant level? So if you haven't, that you have what's called significant and unavoidable impacts. And the EIR has to disclose these, and these are very important. You really should hone in on what are the significant unavoidable impacts of the project. These are the consequences of the project that are deemed significant, and yet, with all feasible mitigation imposed, cannot be avoided. So if you approve the project, this is going to happen, and it's going to be significant. Now, up to now, I've really been talking about individual impact areas, air quality, land use, hazards, associated with an individual project. CEQA recognizes, however, that the impacts of a project aren't limited to the project itself, and that you have to take a step back and see the forest for the trees. And that's why CEQA requires you to consider cumulative impacts. Now, cumulative impacts are the impacts of the combined impact of the project as well as other projects that produce similar impacts. Because if we only look at one project and the traffic it's generating, it might be below the level of significance. And so might be the one next door. And so might be the one next door. They're all under that threshold. But really, if we look at all of those projects together, we're going to have a cumulative traffic impact when we consider it at that kind of more global level. So CEQA says you got to look at these. Now, the question becomes, which other projects are you going to look at? Do you consider everything in Southern California, only things on that, only those projects down the street, only those projects in the city? And also, how do you account for what projects are going to be developed and what aren't? Well, CEQA says there's basically two ways you can look at it. You can either look at a list of projects that are already in the pipeline that are likely to be approved in a similar time frame. So if there's applications pending for similar projects, let's look at those, because there's a good chance that those could get approved. We already have an application, and we know what the project is.
And it doesn't necessarily mean projects only in one city.
No.
It's surrounding.
It is within a reasonable area. And what that reasonable list might be could change depending on the type of impact. Now, the other...
I think that's a good point. For instance, when you're looking at traffic, you may want to look at traffic in a 2-mile radius of a project. When you're looking at global warming issues, greenhouse gas issues, then you're looking at statewide. What are the impacts statewide of projects? So the scale and scope when you're looking at cumulative project list is very important.
And like greenhouse gas and global warming is almost like the perfect cumulative impact to consider, because one project is unless it's a huge coal-burning power plant, okay, is unlikely to have a demonstrable impact on global warming. But if you consider that all the projects might be developed across the state or a given large region, those impacts can become cumulatively considerable. So sometimes we can look at just a list of projects and get an idea of what other traffic might be generated. Other times, though, we might want to look at growth projections. So what that means is we're not going to look at specific projects that are in pipeline. What we're going to look at are, what does, for example, our general plan say our goal is for development? If the general plan were to be completely built out, meaning all the residential zones were completely built with homes, all the commercial zones were completely filled with commercial operations, and everything was chugging along, what would the environment look like? And is this project's contribution to whatever that cumulative impact significant? So sometimes you're going to use growth projections, sometimes you use a project list. It all depends on scale of the project, the nature of the project, and it's within the agency's discretion to choose how to do it. After cumulatives, you'll typically jump to project alternatives. And so this is, again, another critical point for you all to focus in on, because CEQA requires you to consider not only the project, but what else could you have put there by comparison. But it's not just any pie-in-the-sky alternative. It would all be, it'd be nice to have some perfect project we could all envision, but CEQA says, no, you have to look at what feasible alternatives there are out there. So we have to look at a reasonable range of alternatives. And reasonable means things that could actually be built. So they have to be feasible. They also have to meet the basic objectives of what the project is. So if, we have somebody wants to build a shopping mall, you can't force them to build a farm as an alternative. That's not a reasonable alternative, because that wouldn't meet the goals of the project applicant. That applicant has a piece of commercial property. They want to build a commercial project. To get them to convert to agriculture, that just doesn't make sense. The other thing, the range of alternatives in the EIR have to be the alternatives have to address one or more of the significant unavoidable impacts of the project. So at this point in the EIR, you will have gone through your impact area by impact area analysis. You will have identified certain areas where there are significant unavoidable impacts. And now you've got a range of alternatives, and they should address some of those significant unavoidable impacts. If we've got a big traffic problem, can we do something with an alternative project that would have less traffic impacts. If we have a big problem with, help me out here, Mark.
If you have a problem with flooding, for instance, if the project has too much hardscape in it, can you change the project? Can you redesign the project in such a way so that you don't have as much runoff occurring and flooding issues aren't as significant? One other thing to consider that's not on here that seems evident, but I'll say it anyways, alternatives can't be more impactful than the project. The alternatives have to address the significant impacts of the project and reduce those significant impacts. Either, as Steve has already said, either one or all of those impacts should be addressed through the alternatives.
CEQA also requires that the EIR look at a no project alternative. And that just means what would happen if the project's denied and nothing happens. Now, that can mean a couple of different things, and CEQA recognizes this. It could mean that the land that the project was located on, nothing happens. It remains exactly as it is. And so the EIR analyzes what would happen if nothing is built. Generally, that's going to have less impact because nothing happens. But CEQA also recognizes that in the case of, say, a general plan amendment or a specific plan, or a zoning change, failure to approve the project doesn't mean nothing will be built. It just means things will be built along the lines of the current planning documents. And so that's also a no project alternative. It just means you look at what's allowed under the current zoning rules and project what would happen versus what would happen with the project. So it's a very thorough range of alternatives, what you're left with. You'll have no project, nothing happens. You have no project, everything goes according to what we currently have in the books. And then you'll have, you already know what the project is, and then you'll have, well, maybe some different projects. What would they do? So the idea is to show the decision makers a full range of what could happen on this property. And then finally, CEQA requires that after you've gone through that range of alternatives, that the document has to identify what's the environmentally superior alternative. So is there a project that avoids all or some of the significant unavoidable project impacts? Now, obviously, the no project, no build project or alternative is generally going to have the fewest impacts because nothing happens. CEQA also says, no, don't stop there. If that would be the environmentally superior alternative, tell us what the next one is. And so the environmentally superior alternative, as determined under CEQA in the EIR, might still have impacts and might not be as good as a no-build alternative. So if this becomes a very common point of confusion for some people. They look at an alternative that might just be, slightly less dense in development than the proposed project, but still would have impacts under the EIR. And then the EIR turns around and says, this is the environmentally superior alternative, when it's just said that the no-build alternative would have no impacts. Well, CEQA says you have to look at, if the no-build is the environmentally superior alternative, find the next one. The next best project, or the next best alternative, and that's the environmentally superior alternative.
Yeah, and I think the reason that this point is important is we all recognize that property owners have rights under their existing zoning. So that even if we don't approve a zone change or a general plan amendment, as Steve said earlier, they still have a zoning designation which by right, in most cases, allow them to build X. So that again, gets back to the no project alternative. What could be built under the current zoning if you didn't change the zoning rules?
Can I use an example that happened
Sure.
in Seal Beach with the Target Shopping Center? The property owner originally came in with an all-residential or primarily residential development, and the city did not approve the project. The underlying zoning was commercial, so the property owner built the commercial shopping center instead of the residential. So there's where the developer used the underlying zoning and got a project, and where the residential project was denied. So there was still a project.
That was the no project existing zoning alternative.
Yeah.
Right, not just, so when they say no project, doesn't mean nothing's going to be built.
Right.
So at the end of it, now those are the basic things you'll see in the EIR. You'll see, you get to the alternatives, that's usually right towards the end. And then you're left with, what do you do now? Well, if you've still got significant unavoidable impacts, you have to weigh those as part of the project approval process. So we're shifting away from certification. What's in the EIR, is it legally adequate? Does it properly disclose everything? And now we're moving into, should we approve the project? So if there are significant unavoidable impacts left according to the EIR, the decision maker is going to have to weigh those impacts against other possible benefits of the project. And so, like it says on the slide here, you can consider economic, legal, social, technological, other benefits of the project. There may be very good reasons to approve a project, notwithstanding significant unavoidable impacts. CEQA was not done with you, though. It still says, you can do that, but if you're going to do that, you have to adopt what's called a statement of overriding considerations, saying what are the benefits of the project that outweigh the significant unavoidable impacts that were identified in the EIR. And there's two main points to requiring that the decision makers to adopt a statement of overriding considerations. And it's disclosure and it's accountability. It's so that everybody knows why what's going to happen if the project's approved and why it's happening anyways.
I think sorry.
Is that determination subject to judicial review?
Yes, it is, but there's a considerable degree of deference that's granted to the agency when they make that determination. It has to be supported by substantial evidence, so they can't be completely contrary to statements in the EIR. If the EIR goes completely a different way, it'd be difficult. Or if there was really no evidence to support, say, the economic or technological benefits of the project, it'd be hard to hold up under judicial scrutiny.
It just seems it could be very subjective. It's
Well, maybe
putting in the eye of the beholder. You know?
Yeah, maybe
It is, but also think about it. This is a legislative determination in many cases. And so the courts are very wary of substituting their judgment for the city council when it comes to, for example, a general plan amendment or a zoning amendment. Because those are legislative decisions that the courts don't intercede in because it's not their place.
Right. I think one, maybe to make this a little more concrete, is if a project has significant job creation benefits, but also has significant traffic impacts, and the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council believe that the job creation by this project outweigh the traffic impacts, even though those traffic impacts can be significant, they can approve the project. And as Stephen just said, there needs to be evidence in the record that this project will create 3,000 jobs, so that when you do make, the decision makers do make that statement of overriding consideration, they're going back to the record to say, based upon the analysis, the full analysis of this project, the benefits outweigh the impacts. So there needs to be some basis for that determination.
Yeah, and CEQA has one little more bit of teeth here. In order to approve a project based on a statement of overriding consideration, the agency must first have adopted all feasible mitigation measures. Anything that was feasible to get that impact as low as you can, even if it's going to remain significant and unavoidable, you still got to adopt it, as long as it's feasible, enforceable, and legal. So you can't just kind of half-heartedly try and mitigate some things, say, oh, well, but we still think it's a good idea. CEQA was going to, that statement of override is subject to challenge if you haven't adopted all the necessary mitigation measures. Okay. So just to kind of close out with some questions to ask yourself when you're done reading the EIR. I mean, has the EIR identified all the significant impacts of the project? Do you have any concerns that there were certain impacts that seemed potentially significant that weren't addressed? Have all those impacts been mitigated? What's left afterwards? Are there any significant unavoidable impacts? Look at the alternatives. Would any of them lessen or avoid the project's significant unavoidable impacts? Nevertheless, even if there's significant unavoidable impacts, are there other considerations? sufficient to support a statement of overriding considerations. And then the ultimate question that it comes down to, after you've gone through the EIR, then it shifts. Should the project be approved? As decision makers and as planning commissioners, you're going to be making a recommendation to the city council on that ultimate question. And I'm available for any further questions.
On the last slide where it says, should the project be approved, does that refer to, should the EIR document itself be approved, or should the overall proposal?
Well, you have to answer both questions.
Okay.
Right. And we were kind of talking about that earlier. Logically and legally, the certification question comes first. You have to have the certified EIR to act on before you can approve the project.
Or in the case of the Planning Commission needs to make its determination on the EIR. You're not the certifying body, the City Council is, but you could make a recommendation to the City Council that we as the Planning Commission believe that the EIR is legally adequate.
Or inadequate.
Or inadequate, and then, well, if it's legally inadequate, then you wouldn't get to the project review question. So I'm assuming that you have already made the finding that the document is legally adequate. Then you shift to the project recommendation. Then you start looking at the project and say, do we think that this is a good project? And then that entire recommendation would go to the City Council for their final determination.
And it comes back to the purpose of the document. It's an informational document so that to provide you with the information you need as a decision maker to then make the decisions. So document first, make sure it's good, understand it, use that information, point two, to make your decision.
As part of approving, or I guess disapproving of the project document, in that document we would have feasible alternatives and mitigation measures identified. So let's say, for instance, we approved that document with all those alternatives and mitigation measures, then what are we approving when we look at the overall project? Are we approving an alternative to what's proposed, or are we?
Well, the project is being presented by the applicant. That's the project. That's the application before you. You can approve or deny that, or recommend approval or denial of that project. But you can also, if say you recommend denial of the project, you could recommend a project alternative. That's perfectly permissible.
I think I'll use an example from my hometown of Pasadena. The City of Pasadena certified a final EIR for the renovation of the Rose Bowl to accommodate an NFL team. So the EIR on that project was certified by the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council. The project itself of renovating the stadium was denied. So all of the environmental effects of the potential project had been fully mitigated through the EIR, but the City Council, first the Planning Commission and the City Council, felt that it just didn't fit with the neighborhood desires and the neighborhood wishes, even though all of the environmental impacts had been well documented, fully addressed, and fully mitigated. The community still couldn't get around, we should renovate the stadium to such a degree to make it, to make an NFL team, come there. So there are instances where you can fully analyze a project, approve the EIR and deny it, ultimately deny the project.
I just had one final question, and it's a clerical thing. At what point do we start referring to the document as a draft EIR and a final EIR?
Okay. The draft EIR is what's released for public review at the early stage. So there's an internal draft that gets circulated amongst the city and the consultants who go over it to make sure that the city is okay with what's being presented. And then it goes out for public review. That is deemed the draft EIR. It becomes final once the public comments have been received, the comments from the other agencies, and then the written responses are prepared, and those questions or comments and responses combined with the draft, if it's been revised at all of that becomes the final EIR.
Okay.
And that is what comes forward for review by the Planning Commission.
And then that's, on our schedule here, it says final EIR released for public review. That's supposed to be February 24th.
Right.
So
On
will we
the,
get a new version of,
Yes. There's a new document.
right. The final, so the draft, again, we're not talking specifics about DWP, but just talking about the process to date. The draft EIR for the DWP project was released sometime in early November, early to mid-November.
November 14th.
Thank you. November 14th. The public had 45 days to review that document and comment on that document. We extended that time period because City Hall was closed and it was over the holidays. So the actual comment period ended January 9th, if I recall. So that was the draft EIR, and all of the commissioners received copies of that document. As Stephen said earlier, CEQA, the guidelines say EIR should be between 150 and 300 pages. Well, we well exceeded the 300-page limit. What is now being done is staff and the consultant are going through all of the comment letters that we received in preparing responses. What is tentatively scheduled to be released at the end of this month is the final EIR. The final doesn't include the draft, so what you have really are two separate documents that when you take as a whole is the final document. So you have a draft. What the difference between the draft and the final is the response is the comments that we received from the community, and then all of the responses to those, which, right now we're looking at will be about another 300 pages of documentation. So it's when you take the draft and you take what comes out on February 24th together, those two volumes or 3 or 4 volumes are the final.
And just to clarify, I mean, if you didn't have such a voluminous draft in the first place, you could conceivably just do it in one volume and republish it. Also, CEQA contemplates that you could, beyond just responding to written comments, you could actually go back and change things in the draft and the analysis to address some points or clarify some points, rather than doing it in that separate document. And in some cases, and seen this happen, if you have comments of sufficient importance or significance, you may go back and actually change that draft significantly. Go back and add new analysis, go back and look at something in a different way, in which case CEQA would then require you to recirculate that draft for more public comment.
That's only with a significant change.
Yes.
What about people commenting during the public hearing? Are those comments responded to in the final EIR?
I don't know if they're taken point by point. A lot of that information was taken, well, I guess it was taken after the draft was out there. I'm not sure. I haven't gone, it can be, but also a lot of them are also rehashed in writing.
Right,
so all it's legally
issues
required
that
is
might be new that no one thought of,
yes,
or
well,
some way that it might be considered a significant comment.
Are you talking about, if I can ask to clarify, are you talking about once the final EIR is out,
Yeah.
there's a public hearing on that final EIR, and then somebody raises a question that hadn't been considered?
Yes.
As Stephen was saying, those aren't responded to in writing. Those become a part of the record, and if they can be addressed verbally, or you can point to a couple of sections in the record already where this question has been asked and answered, you don't need to do it in writing. It becomes a judgment call if staff believes that or the decision makers, the Planning Commission or Council, believe that the issue is so significant and so new that hasn't been considered then you go back and you do prepare either a written response, or in some cases, you do new analysis.
And then that triggers recirculation.
And that triggers recirculation. So there is no hard and fast rule on that.
And so one thing to point out here then is that the process is not closed at this point. People are still going to have comments about the final EIR. Those comments can be made at public meetings. They can be submitted in writing. And we'll address the staff will work to address them through this process of these hearings and in the staff reports, and they'll all become part of the record. They're not ignored. They're just don't become part of that final EIR document that's prepared. Because if otherwise, we can be constantly, it's be never-ending process of responding to another comment,
So you would find them in the minutes of the meeting, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, or in the record. If somebody submits something in writing,
That's part of the record. Oh, okay.
It's part of the administrative record of the
Yeah.
proceeding.
Right. I would say probably more importantly than just in the minutes, you would find it in the resolution. If there was a significant issue that was, or a new issue that was raised that didn't require recirculation, it would probably be incorporated into the body of the resolution where, this issue was addressed in this particular manner.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten into the actual mechanics of approval. There's a whole series of required findings that need to be made under CEQA when approving a project that's been subject to an EIR, specific legal sub-conclusions that have to be drafted, and that, like Mark says, that's where you can respond to those issues and lay out why there's evidence that supports the conclusion that recirculation isn't required or that impact has been addressed. That's why I would just, anybody who's listening to the public, if you do have questions or comments about the final EIR as it comes in, the best way to get your comments into the record is to submit them in writing.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the commission?
I might just, and I don't want to keep belaboring the point, but it's a little bit of semantics, because when the public hears final EIR, it sounds like it's a done deal. And there's even been comments raised about the fact that we as a body here, we were never presented the draft EIR. We're just going to be presented the final EIR. But from what you're saying, that the term final EIR is a
term of art.
It's a term. But it doesn't mean that further comments can't be considered, that perhaps additional mitigation measures can't be incorporated into the document. At least, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just a term that's used, but it's still a living document subject to change.
Final EIR means it's the final administrative draft. It's kind of, I almost hate to say that, but it's not final in the sense that the matter is closed and predetermined. We haven't even, it's got to go all the way, it's not done until it's certified by the city council.
But I like
that's the final.
I like the term final administrative draft, because when you put the word draft on it, then you're inviting.
But see, I'm just inviting more.
But you're inviting the public to participate, and that's
Right.
that's important.
And the reason that the terms that we're using are fairly precise under CEQA law, and I think you're right. The public may believe that final means there's no more opportunity to comment, but these are the words that come out of state law, and that's why you call them drafts, and that's why you call them final.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you very much. Very well done.
That was very helpful.
And just one last point. I mean, now turning to you all have seen the draft environmental impact report for the DWP project, and you're going to see the final. If there's specific questions that any of you have about what you're reading, I would recommend that you contact staff with those questions. It's important that you understand the document, and if you have serious questions about what you're reading or how you should be reading it, staff is a resource there. There are plenty of professionals who can help you to understand that information.
Thank you. Okay, that takes care of scheduled matters. there are no public hearings at this time. And if the director is ready, can we have your report, please?
Yes, thank you very much. At our next meeting on February 15th, we have one item. It's actually two items. The one item that was continued from earlier this evening, and a second item in Surfside, which is a variance for A95 and a minor use permit for A95. That was also the item that was continued.
Yeah.
So,
So we'll have two Surfside.
Two Surfside projects, yes. I would also like to update the Planning Commission on an item which you saw back in November, which was a request for reasonable accommodation, also in Surfside at A114. The Planning Commission continued that item to allow the applicant to submit plans to show how they could accommodate two vehicles on site. They haven't submitted those plans to city staff yet. We're going to give them basically 30 days to submit plans and then carry out the project. If they don't, this will then become a code enforcement item because we have improvements out there that were installed without building permits. So we're continuing to work with them. We hope that they do submit plans, and if not, it will become a code enforcement item.
Is this the project where the elevator was put in?
That's correct, yes. A couple of other items real quick. Speaking of the DWP project, there are a couple of meetings which are coming up. On Monday, February 6th at 6 p.m., there's a subdivision technical advisory review, and that meeting will be, again, at 6 p.m. in the City Council chambers. The Technical Review Committee, according to the city's municipal code, consists of myself, the city engineer, and the building official. And that meeting is just to review the technical compliance with the subdivision map that the applicant submitted.
And what date is that?
Monday, February 6th.
Oh, okay.
It's on our little schedule they gave us.
Yeah.
Yes. There's two other meetings which are coming up related to DWP. One is the Tree Advisory Board. That meeting is on February 14th at 3 p.m.
Which
Tree Advisory Board?
Okay.
The Tree Advisory Board has two issues that they'll be reviewing. One is the potential removal of existing street trees on First Street to allow for the construction of the new road, and then the tree palette for the new street trees within the tract if and when the project is approved. So the Tree Advisory Board looks at planting palette for new trees as well as tree removal. So that meeting's on February 14th at 3 p.m. And then the third meeting related to DWP is the Recreation and Parks Commission meeting, which will be on February 22nd, and that's at 6 p.m. And according to their charter and what the municipal code says, the Recreation and Parks Commission will be looking at the park space that is proposed as a part of the project, the 6.4 acres of open space. And then lastly, I'd like to point out that the Ad Hoc General Plan Local Coastal Program Committee will be meeting on February 14th at 6 p.m. to discuss the housing element. We did receive comments back from the State Department of Housing and Community Development on our draft housing element that was submitted in October. And on the 14th, in a couple of weeks, the ad hoc committee will be working through that letter and talking about potential additional sites for rezoning.
What time is that meeting and where will it be?
That meeting will be in the council chambers, and that meeting is at 6 o'clock on February 14th. So,
Okay, and the other's at 3. Are the two...
yeah, we have two meetings on two different projects on the 14th.
Now, the subdivision technical review committee and tree advisory board, will they both be in this room too?
All of those meetings will be in the council chambers, yes.
Are you going to provide chocolate on February 14th for the...
Chocolate, red roses, and champagne, yes.
You? Just confirming.
Okay.
Just a question, this whole packet of plans that we got, that this is being postponed till next time, do you want us to hold on to
Hold
those,
on
or
to
do you
them.
want to give those back to us?
It's probably easiest if you leave them here, unless you have a need to take them home. It's probably easiest that you keep them here, and then we'll make sure that you get them back again in 2 weeks.
Will you make sure we get the same sets back?
If you wrote notes, just write your name on them, and we'll,
I've made notes on mine. That's
I'm sure
fine.
you have, Dave, so good. No, seriously, we'll just write your name on it, and we'll make sure that you get them back.
Thank you.
Christine.
And that concludes...
My no notes.
Okay, that concludes my report.
Mark, regarding the housing element, are you going to be making a presentation before the city council on the 13th regarding the housing element?
On the 13th, there is an item that Councilmember Miller has asked to be placed on the agenda. That's his item, and he'll be discussing it. So we're not talking about the housing element. He would like to talk about the ad hoc committee and some potential changes to the committee.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any commissioners' concerns?
I had one tonight. I noticed that the Fresh and Easy that we approved last summer is well under construction. I was wondering if there has been any follow-up by staff on the conditional approval items as far as what Fresh and Easy had agreed to do for the neighbor directly behind them.
We actually just talked about that this morning. They have done the window replacement, which was one of the off-site improvements that they were required to do. And Jerry, that's correct. They have finished that.
Yes, they have installed the window. We did discover that they failed to procure a building permit before they installed the window, but they did come in this morning and rectify that, so they have been issued a permit. The windows have been installed. I was going to try and follow up either tomorrow or early next week with the property owner just to... We've been trying to keep an open line of communication with that property owner just to ensure that she's satisfied and that Fresh and Easy is living up to their end of the deal.
Great, thank you.
I saw it yesterday, and it looks like they're restuccoing that side of part of that house, so I wondered if they even put some additional insulation in or something. But maybe that was in conjunction with the windows.
They may have broken some stucco around where they took the old windows out, so it might just be a patch job. I'm not aware that they're actually restuccoing her house, but maybe that was a bonus part of the deal.
There's a fairly large area by the windows. It's just like tar paper and chicken wire now. So it looks like they're doing what they were supposed to.
Anyone else?
I had a question on the request that went in for money from the state to expand Marina Park. Has there been any follow-up on that or any response from the state on that?
There was one person that came down from the state, and this was at the end of summer. They did do a tour of the potential park expansion site and the west part of Old Town. They also asked for some additional information from the city on the property and potential purchase of the property from ExxonMobil. We haven't had any communication with them for probably about 5 months now.
Did you respond to their...
Yes, we did. We've provided them all of the information. Actually, Public Works has been doing a great job managing the project and responding to all of their requests for information. So at this point, as far as I know, the state has all the information that they need, and if I recall correctly from the schedule, they would be making the announcements in the springtime. So we should know within the next 4 to 5 months whether or not we are a grant recipient.
It seems to me that that project is so physically close to the DWP project that, as you were saying today, one of the things we have to do is look at a big picture,
Cumulative projects, yes.
it's really going to be important that we have as much information about that project as we can get.
Right. That project, without getting into too many specifics, of course, as the project was submitted by the city to the state, the city council, if you will recall, there were 3 or 4 different options. There was the $10 million option. That option that the city council directed staff to submit as part of the grant request is assumed to be the project that will be built on that site for the EIR purposes. That goes back to the cumulative project list. What do you assume based upon what's in the pipeline? We have to assume, the EIR has to assume, we will get funded for that. That park will be built out, and then the impacts of that project become part of the overall impacts to the DWP project. That's, if I can just go one step further, as Stephen said earlier, CEQA takes a conservative approach or a worst-case approach. So if that project, the Marina Park expansion, doesn't happen, we've overanalyzed what could happen in that neighborhood. So that goes back to the conservative nature of an EIR. So the worst case would be you build a park, you build a swimming pool, you're generating X number of vehicles per day in that neighborhood. If it doesn't happen, okay, great. Well, then the project impacts, the neighborhood impacts are less.
Next, the Rite Aid property in Rossmore Center there. What is the status of the 2 buildings that are still there, the KFC and the Verizon building? They're coming down.
They will be coming down. We don't have a definite date as to when that will happen, and my understanding that we have not yet issued demolition permits for that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to Commissioner Cummings' question. I'm having
You're having a senior moment. You're not even a senior.
There's always the 15th of February, you could bring it back.
Okay, no, I've remembered my question, thank you. Regarding the Marina property, ExxonMobil, is there anything that staff has learned that you can share regarding the timeline for when ExxonMobil would be willing to sell that property and what a ballpark price would be?
I have not been involved in any of those discussions. I do know that there have been a handful of discussions with them, but I don't know if there's been any preliminary terms that have been discussed. What I can say about that is just in general, property negotiations are something that the City Council discusses in closed session for obviously financial purposes, and it's prior to the acquisition that number would be made public. But I don't even know if any of those, if dollars have been talked about yet.
Well, in terms of the readiness of the property to be sold, I know there was a lot of questions about the environmental status.
Yes.
Is the property in sellable condition now, or is there a timeline for it to become in sellable condition? You know that?
I don't know those questions. Again, I do know that Sean, the Public Works Director, has been involved in that, but I don't know how deeply they've gotten into that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have no comments, and we are adjourned. See you on February 15th at 7:30.
And the 14th. And